Hello everyone, welcome to the New York Times Climate Hub. My name is Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and this feels like, actually probably is, the kickoff session for week 2 of COP. I don't know if they're doing anything this early over in the blue zone, but thank you very much everyone joining us online, in the room here. This is the coolest place at COP. I know that for a fact because I once showed up at the press center in the blue zone and they saw my New York Times Climate Hub lanyard and said, "Hey, where is that? Everybody's asking, how do I get there?" Well, there's a story attached to that too. It's quite a walk, but this is the place to be. Thank you very much for being here. We're doing this in partnership with Ericsson, and we're delighted to be doing that, not least because they're a big part of the question, which is, how far can we go with the technology we already have? This feels very appropriate because, I mean, pick your cliche, right? This is the week when, you know, the rubber hits the road. Enough with the talk, let's have action. That's the narrative as we move from week 1 to week 2. It's an extremely important theme. And I'm going to introduce our 3 guests because we have one online as well in just a second. And I hope that over the course of the next hour, we can really get into this. But first, for those who haven't been to a ThinkIn before, very briefly, it's all about you. And I'm really going to make an effort to bring in people who are involved in the chat. So forgive me in advance if I lean forward, mess with my glasses, and peer at this. I'm not trying to be rude, right? And also, we expect people to keep on coming in, and I will take questions from the room or at any point. And when I say questions, I have to stop myself because we do have this lightly enforced no questions rule, which doesn't mean don't get up and say what you think. It means please do get up and say what you think. I hope that we can hear your views and our guest views on 3 things broadly. The potential of digital tech, 5G, Internet of Things, to maximize efficiencies and minimize our footprint as a species, on the risks as well as the opportunities of relying on technology at all. And I think, thirdly, one of the sort of implied questions in our framing question, how far can we go with the technology we already have, is how dangerous is it to rely on technology that we don't already have? And I bring that in only really because key people in this debate, including John Kerry, have explicitly said we are going to have to rely, at least in part, on technologies that are not yet proven. So with that, the hour will fly by. Please don't delay on jumping in, because otherwise we'll get to 10 minutes to go and everyone will think, I want to say that, and we won't have time. I want to come first to Emily Olander. You are the Climate Action Program Manager at Ericsson. You've got skin in the game. Ericsson's a big builder of 5G kit, and you've done some research as an organization, which says, among other things, that wholesale switch to 5G would be the equivalent of taking 1 in 7 cars off the EU's roads. Can you, I mean, building new technological infrastructure does have its own carbon footprint. So can you just explain in broad terms how it is that, on balance, you're pretty confident that it's sort of a net positive?
Thank you so much. I think it's a really good question, but just taking a step back, I think, you know, the title of this session is so great, you know, and we did some research back in the Times, released the Exponential Climate Action Roadmap in 2018, together with Johan Rockström, a famous scientist, as you know, actually discussing how do we get to 2030 halving emissions as we need to do. And what they actually show there, not only digital technology has a part to play in that, but we actually have the technologies to halve emissions by 2030. And I think we need to remember that. So we take action now, and the role in that exponential roadmap that also been released twice now, the latest one was in 2019. And we saw that, with the ICT sector, who has, a global carbon footprint of 1.4%, as you have now in the slides as well, but we can enable carbon reductions in other sectors by 15%. So we have a more than 10 times enablement effect in other sectors. I think understanding that impact versus, the positive, or as you say, negative of our own sector, we know that we can do much more if we implement it correctly.
Right.
You can also do it wrongly, as we see, for example, like, maybe Uber, or, having some digital technologies that maybe increase and have a rebound effect. So of course we don't have to do that, but everyone, we have the potential to do this if we implement it. We saw it during the pandemic, working from home, just within Ericsson, we have reduced our business flight by 85% in emissions, just because we don't travel during the pandemic. Right. So it's possible, and we didn't think it was possible, but now we've shown it's possible to do that. And it's the same when you look at the 5G as a technology. Of course, you have a carbon footprint, producing the equipment, but because you're using it such a long time, the electricity consumption of the product is the most important. And here 5G is the most energy efficient standard. So that's why we need it if we need to go forward. But then you also have to think about how do you modernize the network to do that correctly. So you're actually expanding the 5G, but maybe we can come back to that.
Well, I mean, the key number there is the 15%, enabling reductions of 15%. For someone like me, who's sort of just getting the hang of calling an Uber, what are the main sectors? Are we talking? I mean, I can see how it's fantastic that Martha can join us without having got on a plane. Yeah. That's a pretty straightforward saving, and that's reflected in the other number you mentioned, 85% savings within Ericsson by not traveling so much. But what are the other areas in which you've got a clear and obvious emissions saving as a result of 5G, or we can call it something else, and we can call it Internet of Things, whatever you want to call it.
Exactly. I think digital technologies are so broad, so it's depending how you see it. For example, one of the things that maybe you don't think about it, the port. So logistical sectors, like we've had a Porto Livorno case where we reduced just one terminal emissions by 8% by implementing 5G and optimizing the route, and how they lift the cargoes, and being smart with your data. Then you're also being smart with how you're using, for example, cars or trucks within the area. So just optimizing the operations can reduce. Then of course you can have.
So wait, there we're talking about cranes moving containers around.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're still sort of diesel cranes, are they? But they're just doing it more efficiently.
Yeah, most efficiently, and also the small trucks going around in the in the harbor as well. So you can do quite a lot. It's just how you implement it. And you have the transport sector, also the agricultural one. And I think the agricultural one, you can do so much. We haven't really, tapped that into, because it's quite an efficient sector. Like, and also a lot of investment needs to go in there. And for the farmers, like, they don't have that investment. But if you unleash the digital technology and maybe 5G, you can maybe go to smaller tractors that can be then electricity derived. So you actually have a more optimized way of doing that, and maybe then unleashing or bridging the divide of the investment needed to actually have farming equipment. And I think you all know how much investment and big those tractors are that they need to do today to make it go around in the economy. So it's across all sectors basically, including our own.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll come back to the potential embedded carbon in 6G and 7G if we have time. Can I come to Martha Lane Fox, Baroness Lane Fox? I hope you're with us.
Hello.
I'm told you are. Hello. Co-founder of lastminute.com and director of, I didn't really know about Peers for the Planet, but you are director of Peers for the Planet and Chancellor of the Open University. Martha, thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
It looks a bit sunnier down in London than it is up here. You said when we were speaking before that actually by your assessment, we don't know yet whether the internet broadly defined is a net carbon sink or source. Do I have that right? And if so, how can that be after all these years and the internet being the world's great data collector?
I think it's a real challenge to assess the number and how you would judge it. You know, the internet isn't really one thing anymore. There, of course, is the basic infrastructure that's connects us all together, and we've relied on so heavily over the last 18 months, 20 months particularly. But you know, this has been well documented. There are now many internets. There's the Chinese internet, which is fueling a whole bunch of things that we don't really have any oversight of here in the West, or consideration of. It's hard to gauge. There's the Facebook internet, which is an entirely private company building its own different kind of wall garden. So there are many different, and then you've got the sort of Western European, more liberal internet with the web interfaces that Tim Berners-Lee built on top of it. So, you know, that's a very, very basic description of some suggestions of how the internet is split up, but it's also incredibly hard to assess from which angle you look at how you are considering the consumption, whether you're looking at it as an individual level, at an organizational level, corporate level, and so on. But, you know, listening to the speakers that preceded me, I have to say I share less optimism. You know, I have had a backdrop of technology my whole working life, and I find it both depressing and surprising that in the industry that based my career around, we haven't got a more urgent sense of how we need to solve some of the issues that we're talking about today. And what I would like to throw in the mix is following the money, right? I mean, I think that is often the most revealing place to start. You can kind of use your data to try and assess what the net contribution of the internet is overall. But if you look at the venture capital market, the kind of R&D spending that we have in the technology sector that comes from government, corporations, and venture capital, it is around 80 billion that goes into climate solutions. Amazon alone's R&D spend, this is The Economist was writing about this just last week, is double that. You know, that is a metric that I think we should be very alarmed by, because, you know, you asked about John Kerry's statement about innovation. Well, if the entire R&D investment into climate solutions is less than one company's own R&D into its own company, then I really think we have to be extremely challenging to the sector about how we can move this on, because that is not enough, and there is not enough urgency around this. And you read every day about new CRM software being developed, or, you know, another piece of software that may or may not be useful to the climate crisis, but we need to put more urgency around this investment number.
Just to be clear about that comparison with Amazon,
yeah.
You're comparing the total R&D spend from the venture capital
governmental
related sectors with Amazon's R&D budget overall,
yeah,
not Amazon R&D into climate solutions.
No, overall, yeah. So it's half that of Amazon's overall R&D. That's an Economist number from last week, if anyone wants to get more depth and detail on that.
But Martha, we hear so much from business in general right now about a sea change in attitudes in boardrooms, in the shift from discussion of climate, from ESG silos to the boardroom, that I've started to believe it, right? Are you saying that that's not true? Or are you saying that actually, paradoxically, ironically, the tech sector is lagging the rest of business?
When I think all things are true. You know, this is complex and nuanced. Yes, of course, there is more discussion of ESG at the boardroom. You know, I'm the board of 3 different organizations. We transfer a company I chair, a B Corp, a technology scaled business, about nearly 100 million users, thereabouts, registered B Corp, huge focus on ESG and climate solutions, right? That's one example. We also sit on the board of Twitter, again, huge commitment to ESG, a different kind of business, not making direct R&D investments in quite the same way. We also sit on the board of Chanel, not a technology company, trying to be net zero over the next decade, huge commitment around mission 1.5. All of those things contribute to the landscape that we're talking about. But you know, none of them are going to come up with huge climate innovations using technology that I think we still need in order to urgently address challenges right now. These are all, you know, internal targets to move to more carbon neutral companies. And, you know, that's real, but it may not add up in sum total to the change that we need. And that, I think, is the urgency that we need to stay focused on. And because of that, I would say follow the money. Look at who is distributing the money and where it is going, and is that enough? And, you know, I just think it's worth provoking that question constantly, because I don't believe personally that enough money is going towards climate-focused solutions.
Thank you so much. While we have you there, I want to ask you another question. Then, if possible, before we come to Helen, if you'd be interested, Catherine, in expanding on your point you've made in the chat about expanding the opportunity for total emissions while making savings at the margin, we can come to you. But Martha, just while we're talking, you raised another point about diversity.
Yes.
Do you think the tech sector has hobbled its own ability to be a solution to the climate problem by not being diverse enough, by having the wrong people in key places at a key time?
100%. You know, I would say that. Obviously, it's, to me, again, absolutely linked with, you know, where investment and money is going, because, you know, people invest and support in, put attention into things that they feel kind of comfortable around. And, you know, there is always this somewhat subconscious bias to put focus and attention and resources into stuff that you understand. And if you have only a limited number of people making those decisions, you won't get to such good decisions or such wide-ranging ones. And, you know, just looking at the venture capital market, which again is not my sector, so I'm sure other people in the room may be able to give more depth and detail on this, but, you know, watching it from the outside, only 9% of venture capital partners are women, and only 2% of venture capital, 2%, goes to female-founded businesses. Now, that's only one axis of diversity. Obviously, you've got ethnic diversity, you've got socioeconomic diversity, and we know that all of this is going to fall on the most vulnerable communities. So there is a piece here that urgently needs to be joined up, in my opinion. It's not new news. You know, we need more people, full stop, in the technology sector who are not, who are going to add that diversity to the sector, but we also specifically need more people making decisions around investment, because I think the broader number of people you have in the room, the different decisions that will get made, and the more, you know, interesting and diverse solutions, I think, will bubble up. So it's all part of the same ecosystem.
And would they bubble up quickly enough? This is what scares me. We are at least making ourselves aware at COP of the urgency of the issue.
Yes.
When you talk about something as systemic as that, you're thinking,
yes,
you know, there's the whole hiring earthquake to go through.
Nope, I agree, but it's not just a hiring earthquake. You know, there are people in the sector. I think that there's just needs to be much more visibility given to the diverse people that are coming through the ranks, you know, and a bit more boldness made in decision making. You put people on your boards, make them partners that you may not feel are like completely ready in the traditional sense, but that will add immeasurably to the conversations that we're having. So I think often we are further along than we think, but we just don't recognize the amount of talent and the amount of diverse talent that is available to us. So we've got to think more creatively and more differently. I'm a huge champion for fast tracking people through systems. You know, you don't have to have gone through the traditional career path. Look at me, I had this incredible outlier experience and have had all these amazing opportunities as a result of it. So there are people out there. We've got immense talents across the world, but we do need to be bolder in how we think about it.
Thank you very much. Catherine, can we come to you? Because I thought you were picking up on Emily's point. If not, I often get a
yeah, sorry, I'm a little bit unprepared.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you know? I apologize. Last week there was just an awful moment when this guy made a really good point, and I didn't see the message in the chat. This is why I apologize in advance. And he was great when we came to him, but it was only afterwards that I realized he didn't want to talk at all. Anyway, sorry. Now we've ambushed you.
I'm a lot better on typing than I am on speaking, but yeah, I mean, so I was really just raising the point, and I think a couple of others have picked up on it, that you know, all this, and I'm a technologist myself, I should point out, that, you know, all of the sort of ways of using technology to reduce emissions are just great, so long as they are actually used to reduce emissions rather than to create capacity for further growth. There's a thing called the Jevons paradox, which I'm sure a lot of people here are very aware of.
I'm not. Can you say what it's called again?
well, it's called I think Jevons paradox. So an engineer called Jevons in the 19th century sort of pointed out that if you build more railroads, you will increase the amount of traffic, the amount of freight being moved, and it's why building roads doesn't necessarily reduce congestion, and it's also why building wind turbines may well increase the amount of renewable energy, but it doesn't necessarily reduce the overall carbon emissions. And I think we see a lot of this in companies, particularly, who do a lot to reduce their so-called emissions intensity. Yeah. So the carbon emissions per dollar earned or per widget produced or whatever, but because they continue to make more widgets and increase the number of widgets or whatever they're whatever it is they're doing, our carbon emissions go up and up. So my argument would be that we absolutely have the technologies we need to reduce emissions. They are things like the bicycle for every trip under 5 miles. They are insulating your home rather than putting in heat pumps everywhere. They're these kind of quite low-tech, potentially reasonably low-tech things that would make a huge difference if there was just an ounce of political will. And also, and I am on a bit of a rant here, if the so-called corporate sustainability movement would get off the lawn and give some space and perhaps encourage those kind of simpler and more low-tech and low-carbon approaches to life.
Thank you. Just a thought. Rant, most welcome. I'm really glad that we came to you. Helen Clarkson, you are CEO of the Climate Group, and for my money, probably the most connected person at COP. Because from what I can gather, that's a key part of the way you do things. You find out who can actually make a difference and go and nobble them. Mm-hmm. Share with us your reaction to the conversation so far, and in particular, if you will, talk a bit about tech more broadly defined. Because, well, I mean, in a sense, as Catherine was saying, in the end, technology is not just information technology. There's other stuff that we have to use too, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. And it's really fascinating to hear that, and really interested to hear what Martha had to say, actually, because I agree with her a lot. So Climate Group is a non-profit organisation, so mission-driven, and our mission is to drive climate action fast. And we do that by bringing together companies and governments, and in particular, getting them to make commitments at sort of the 100% level or the zero. So 100% renewable electricity, 100% of their fleets will be electric vehicles, or a commitment to procuring zero carbon steel by 2050. And the idea there is if you get a company to commit at that level, they can't all think that, they all know that they're part of it. If you make a 96% commitment, great. Everyone in the company thinks they're in the 4%. Oh yeah, they'll be doing that down there. I'll carry on over here. So you've got to get that high level commitment. And what we find is that then companies do start to innovate and about the way that they do things. And they tend to, we've seen a lot of hitting targets early. In our RE100 campaign, so renewable electricity, we have a lot of the big tech companies. Now that's about their own emissions. They're putting up, we've got Google, Facebook, Apple, and others. It's their global emissions. So it's all about how they manufacture, how they run data centers, and so on. And that's great. And we see those companies being incredibly active. And where they're active in particular is around policy work. And we're doing a lot of policy work in Asia because we've got a lot of companies committed in places like South Korea, Japan, where you just actually can't really buy renewable energy. And a lot of that is to do with how the government has set the market structures to make it just so hard. So what we do is bring those companies together. We got 50 companies that are present in Japan to write to the Japanese government and say, we're here, we're ready. If you can change the way that you structure power purchase agreements, we will buy renewable electricity, and that helps to trigger the change. So that's sort of what we do globally. Why I was nodding along to Martha is 3 or 4 years ago, there was a conference in San Francisco. Governor Brown going out of office, he's been absolutely a climate champion of his time. So Governor Jerry Brown, brilliant. he was coming out of office, and so he held this global climate action summit. It was his swan song, you know, big event. We could not get Silicon Valley interested. We're right there. Nothing really happening. And as I say, they're doing a lot on their own emissions. But what we're seeing since then is now we're seeing these books come out. You know, Bill Gates has written a book, and so, you know, and John Kerry in this kind of statement around, you know, there's innovations to come. You know, we've got it's all about.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, it's a now problem. And like you've said, like Martha said, we've got a lot of technologies now, and we've got to look across the whole economy. So if you think about, you know, we sort of break things out into systems, energy systems. We've got most of what we need in the energy sector. Transport, EVs have come a really long way. You know, the cars that are coming out now, their range is going to cover, particularly a country like the UK, will cover most of what you need to do. But that's increasing every year. You know, then you start to move into sort of food, heavy industry, the built environment. We're hearing about heat pumps and insulation. And the issue for all of those things, and for a lot of the technology we've got, is we've got the innovation. We don't have an innovation problem. We've got this scale problem. Mm-hmm. How do you get things to scale? And that, you know, a lot of it we hear like, oh, it's individual behaviors. It's got to come from government. There's got to be incentive schemes. We've got to have a way of getting this technology out there. And that's the kind of complex work of, you know, taking businesses to government and saying, if you do this, we'll support you and so on. But it's really complex in terms of how do you get that change? And I worry that this kind of, you know, and on the diversity point, this kind of Silicon Valley type attitude that there's one more great thing to come, and you know, the kind of we're going to be the ones that go and find it. It's like most of it we've got,
right? And
the stuff that we don't have is in things like, you know, how do you decarbonize steel? That's really complex. I don't think that's what Bill Gates is going to go and solve.
It's fascinating. I mean, in fairness to John Kerry, as I've followed his language, he's gone from we're going to use technologies that haven't been invented yet to this past week at COP, we're going to use technologies that haven't been scaled yet.
Right.
So he's got that. And in fairness to Silicon Valley, well, to those of its representatives who are here, they're saying we're here to help you scale.
Yeah.
I mean, Emily, I feel I need to give you a chance to come back here because Ericsson's not physically in Silicon Valley, but as builders of the hardware that goes with the software, you're potentially a big part of moving this around. I mean, in all candor, have you felt as an organization that that you've had to sort of pull at Silicon Valley, pull at the software guys to get into gear on this?
Okay, so I'm not a Silicon Valley girl, but actually we have a CTO who is in Silicon Valley, so I think we are there. I just talked to him last week. So, but I actually heard from my manager that I think, you know, in terms of, you know, Silicon Valley, it's really dense in terms of innovation and stuff. But I think even, you know, Stockholm, in terms of density, you know, have the same or even more, you know, type of unicorns and, you know, innovation. Yeah. So I think, you know, you can look at Silicon Valley, but you have so many other parts of the world to do the same. And I really enjoyed the discussion because I think firstly, just coming back to, you know, the carbon intensity problem, which I think is really insane. And I think from Ericsson's side and what we also have tried to do, because we agree, we need to look into absolute emission reductions. And also if you then, you know, acquire new companies, you have to look into that. So we do the absolute reductions and not, you know, expanding and then think it's okay because yeah, we're just taking a small part of the market. And I think doing that, and that's why we've been quite really interested in the standardization community of, you know, working how you set the net zero definitions. And we have Ericsson Research, a part of the ITU standardization for net zero that draws upon the Science-Based Target Initiative net zero standard, but also the Race to Zero. But, you know, are then of course looking into the ICT sector only. Mm-hmm. So we have that, and having those standards is absolutely necessary. So you get the trajectories to reduce emission, and it's the reduction. It's not any offsetting or, you know, so you start with that. And I think we've seen now during COP so many, you know, net zero claims, and also when you talk about net zero, we always talk about the value chain. If you don't say anything else, for example, net zero in operations, then you know it's operations, right? And you have to be so clear about how you need to go there now. What are you doing now? Because net zero 2025, it's not really possible for any company because we don't have, we can't reduce in that rate. And then it's so much based on offsetting. And I think that's really I'm really afraid of having, of having those claims. And so we have to be really sure about that we set the reduction rates and do it now and be transparent about that. And I think we try to do that more.
Well, let me pick you up. In a minute, I'd love to come to Paul Clark because he's saying something I think quite nuanced and important about systems in the chat. So Paul, if you wanted to expand on that, we'll come to you in a second. But just on these interim targets, I notice that whenever we have someone from Stockholm or Oslo or Denmark in a ThinkIn, there's a lot of talk about the exponential roadmap and about the importance of 2030 and 2040, not just 2050. Why aren't more people talking about the exponential roadmap, or at least about those interim targets? You don't have to use the jargon, but I do worry here especially that a lot of organizations and countries are showing up and saying, okay, here's our 2045 or our 2050 target. You all right with that?
Yeah.
No.
No.
Is it a Scandinavian thing?
Yeah, so it was started in Scandinavia by Johan Rockström and also Johan Falk, together with academia, businesses as Ericsson and other, and also I think civil society in a way, really trying to say the first objective was to say, can we halve emissions by 2030? And it was all based on the carbon law of halving emission every decade, but realizing that to be able to reach 1.5 degrees, you have to do it now, right? If you don't do anything after 2030, it's not really almost not possible, right? So building on that, we started to expand. And of course, when you have a network, it's always easier to start where you are at. So you have, but that it's expandable. And also the companies that are a part of that, we have, IKEA, Ericsson, and we would just expand on that. So they are global companies. Ericsson have 100,000 people around the world. We are more than 180 countries. So yeah, we're maybe Swedish from the start, but I can't say, we're global now. So getting those companies that have a scale, but also the small solutions, climate solutions company that can really push a different. But I think what has Exponential Roadmap, that is now Exponential Roadmap Initiative, that, more drive the narrative of the roadmap, have really pushed in halving by 2030 as a message, for example, in the UN Race to Zero. So it also comes forward. And I think also even World Economic Forum have, started to put it that message. So I think it's started to come, even though it's not Exponential Roadmap, but the halving message should be the same for.
Yeah, I mean, I think that has got currency. And actually, sometimes those longer headlines overshadow that 2030. But if you look at the China commitment, they've got a 2060 and a 2030. So they say what they're doing by 2030. So they're talking about peak emissions. And similarly with the India, there was a lot of focus on 2070 as well, then at zero date. But actually they talked about, 45% of energy from renewable sources by 2030. So that 2030.
Wait, that's China?
No, that's India.
Oh, sorry.
So that was one thing they announced last week. And I think the headlines often go to that long-term goal, but there is quite a lot of currency around what are you doing by 2030. We also sort of push on, okay, but what are you doing tomorrow? Yeah. Because even 2030, we've got to halve emissions by 2030. And I think that is sort of widely talked about and is seen as the next big kind of challenge.
Well, I'm glad that the message is getting through. Paul, did you want to expand on your point? Can we come to Paul?
Sure. I suppose the point I'm really trying to make is, we can do a lot and we need to do a lot in terms of the technology. But quite frankly, if we do that and just do that, it's not going to move the dial a huge amount, because, we need to radically change our ways of thinking and acting, as a species. And I think that's an even greater challenge than the technology one, quite frankly. And I think we're seeing that play out now, in COP. And we've got to think in not just in terms of systems, we've got to think in terms of ecosystems, we've got to think, much further ahead, because many of the current challenges we're trying to address, we've probably lost the battle on those, and we need to move upstream. If you're trying to take pollution out of a river, you don't do it near the mouth of the river. You go up to the source and really start trying to tackle things where you can have greater impact. And we need that kind of thinking. And we need basically much better vision, as a species, for where we want to head. And unfortunately, vision is always, in scarce supply, at an organizational level and indeed at a government or country level. So there's a lot to do, but I think it's around the thinking rather than, the socio-technical, not just the technical.
And Paul, looking globally, any reasons to be cheerful? Whether it's in government, business, elsewhere, do you see the kind of vision that you're talking about actually sort of harnessed to leadership? A lot of people have the vision. I was at the protest as a reporter on Saturday. There's a lot of people with vision, but they're not necessarily in positions to make stuff change.
Well, I mean, I suppose the immediate answer to your question would be no, not much. But I mean, there are some rays of sunshine. I mean, I think, as I said right at the start in the chat, there's a constant fixation on the digital, and and that's wonderful. And I'm a huge supporter of the digital, but it's not where the rubber hits the roads. We need this kind of new kind of cyber physical thinking where we connect our digital and physical worlds with better models and it's. The physical is often neglected. VCs don't like to invest in it. We see it as less academic in terms of what we teach at schools. We've got to turn up the dial on the kind of graphic equalizer of innovation to put more emphasis on the physical. And I don't see enough of that.
Thank you very much. Martha, if we could come back to you. I want to play venture capital, Silicon Valley's advocate here just for a second, because if you look at the sort of raw scale of the problem, we have soaring global energy demand, we have net emissions rising when they need to be falling. Is it not the case that even if the technology that we have, just to return briefly to the sort of our starting question, can be used much more effectively towards the goals that we share, even if that happens, and even if policy and finance all align towards net zero goals and the interim goals that we've been talking about? Isn't it the case that we do need a great technological leap forward? And isn't it the case that Silicon Valley, as the principal sort of innovator, has shown an ability to deliver what, frankly, I mean, we now take for granted this iPad, but it's an absolute miracle. The fact that we're talking like this is a miracle. I can see that there are risks in relying on it, but isn't it fair to perhaps look at it a different way and put the spotlight on tech and say, come on, step up, deliver?
I completely agree. And, I am not a kind of techno-utopian, crazy, insane person who thinks everything can be reduced to ones and noughts to solve problems. But think of how Tesla has completely and totally changed the dynamics of the automotive industry in a very relatively short space of time. So, of course, this is the point, right? There are huge leaps forward that we can make. And I still believe so very deeply in my core about the power of innovation. But I guess my point is twofold. Firstly, it's just not happening quickly enough and fast enough with enough money and weight behind it. And as a subsection of that, enough people involved from diverse backgrounds that will therefore come up with more interesting solutions. And then as a second kind of corollary to that, which I think links some of the points that other guests have made, it's easy to forget that nearly half the world is not on the internet, right? We still have an enormous job in using the technology that we have to the advantage of everybody. I've been chairing the select committee in the House of Lords looking at the long-term implications of COVID, and we did some work at the beginning of this year looking at living online, not just about digitization and purely the online world, but to the speaker before point, looking at the kind of hybrid world and what we need to do to organize around that to make the most of it for everybody. Half of people cannot work just from home. Half of people, globally don't have access to the internet. These are also enormous, in my opinion, pieces of low-hanging fruit in order to help us reach a more more likelihood of reaching net zero targets because of all the things that previous guests have spoken. So it's not just about the big innovation pieces and the glamorous steps forward. It is also about encouraging the innovation around how we think about connections and digitization of what we have already, and extending that to close the digital divide globally, which I think is such a fundamental building block of all of this as well.
I'd like to come in a second. Please stay there, Martha. I'd like to come in a second, perhaps to Andrew Girdwood in the chat, because you're talking about a fundamental tension here. But Martha, while we're with you, you've twice mentioned finance, and you've made the point that not enough money is going where it needs to go. I can't let this pass without you giving your response to the finance day that happened last week, at which a frankly bonkersly huge number of 130 trillion was banded around. But underneath that, isn't there a genuine shift in capital's appetite for the kinds of projects that we want to see succeed? And isn't that a reason to be optimistic?
Of course, I mean, keep being optimistic. I agree, but we also have to be realistic and look at where we are now. And I guess, all of the efforts around Mark Carney's incredible push to move the finance sector in a more sustainable direction are extraordinary. But that it sometimes feels decoupled from the other point here, which is about specifically R&D spending and innovation spending. And if you believe that we still need to make those leaps, that's the chain that needs to be linked through, right? It's not just about the macro picture of finance. It's also about the specifics around R&D, which has been on the decline, for decades. It's not just a new phenomenon that we've seen in the last decade. So last couple of years. So it is about making the chain, the link through the whole chain, in my opinion. But of course, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be applauding and hoping that the extraordinary agreements that Mark Carney has been putting together don't realize very tangible gains, of course.
And very briefly, let's park the 130 trillion figure for a moment. Another one that's been cited is by 2025, there'll be 50 odd trillion dollars worth of assets in search of ESG investments. Another one that I heard last week from Kerry was that he has personally had undertakings from America's 6 biggest banks of around 5 plus BlackRock, 5 to 6 trillion. Yeah. Do you regard that as real money going to real projects? Does that fall into your R&D category or not yet?
It doesn't fall into the R&D category because it's about other shifts in sectors and how you help them green effectively. And other people here are more expert than me in this. So it's all phenomenal and important, and we should not begrudge it, but it feels like a slightly separate point around deploying what we have now to help make what we are doing currently better, versus deploying new things to invent new ways of doing things that might make huge leaps forward. Both need to happen, in my opinion, and they need to happen urgently.
Thank you very much. The chat is going nuts, but I would like to come to Andrew if we can. You were talking about the tension between evil tech and good tech. How is that going to be resolved? Great to be in your country, by the way.
Thank you. I think you phrased the question I had. I was agreeing and wincing with Baroness Lane Fox when we were talking about the evils of investment capital. And I thought, we're really not helping recruit my tech adverse friends into the cause, because poking fun at investment capital is worthy, but they're not big tech. Big tech is a different company. And then, of course, this is ground we've trodden well before. Big tech could and should do more. But at the same time, the people who say that are also the same people who turn and expect a big tech solution to a lot of their problems. So you have got algorithms. I think Ericsson was talking about the trucks, optimizing delivery schedule routes. This is algorithm. It's easier to deliver to me if Amazon knows when I'm in, and that would obviously mean some data sharing with Amazon. And I'm happy to embrace that for the good of the planet. But I wonder if many people are.
Thank you, Andrew. sound was slightly muffled there, but I think I take your point. But I just want to be clear about one thing, and you might need to lean into the microphone a little bit more. You were saying, taking the example of Emily's example of more efficient routing of industrial vehicles. Are you saying that that is fundamental, or that is at the margin?
I think algorithmic efficiency is fundamental to saving the planet.
Okay, that's a really interesting point, and I hope it's true, because it might be something we can actually do. Luke, my colleague Luke, we seem to be willing to ignore the unsustainability of the supply of technologies as long as the end use cases seem sustainable. Are you making an argument about ends versus means? I'd have thought the end justifies more or less any means here.
I was making an argument more about the embodied carbon of some of the big tech solutions that we're talking about at the moment. Embodied carbon basically just means in its whole lifetime, how many emissions is it responsible for? And the issue we've got with things like solar panels and electric vehicles and some of the more established commercial solutions is that the embodied carbon is still super high. We have carbon intensive processes for making the subcomponents, shipping them around, assembling them. We use rare materials and certainly not green materials quite widely to manufacture them. And then there's an issue also, I think, with the fact that products like Tesla's are being viewed as sort of outrightly or straightforwardly contributing to the solution of replacing high carbon or the high carbon automotive industry, when in fact they're being used quite widely in countries with a non-renewable energy mix. The batteries and, well, as you know, all this, Giles, like the batteries and machining everything is not particularly green at the moment. And I think the point that we have to make here is that there may not actually be such a thing as green tech at the moment, and yet the green tech investing and sort of conversation is very lively. And the unsustainability of providing sustainable solutions like the ones we've just been mentioning is a big issue, and we're going to run into it quite hard in the next 10 to 15 years as the supply of rare metals gets more constrained, or even the political tension around it. A lot of people are aware of how much control some nation states have over certain materials, but the data is out there on how much of this is in China's hands and a select few other countries. So I think being sort of clear-headed about what is sustainable in terms of its supply, not just once we've got it in our driveway or installed in our house or in a field around our town.
Thank you, Luke. Before we run out of time, I want to give our guests a chance to sort of share some final thoughts. Helen, let's start with you. I mean, perhaps what we should try to be is a little bit positive. Look forward to 2030. I'm hesitating because I know that you work principally with kind of movers and shakers rather than consumers. But if you can point to a way in which technology that we have now, broadly defined, is by then going to be making a difference in our lives, something that we might perhaps not be able to anticipate right now.
Yeah, I actually want to quickly pick up on that last point, if that's all right. It's really, he's not wrong in any way at all, but no one ever talks about the embodied carbon of an oil rig. It's really like a double standard that as soon as you get an EV, everyone talks about the embodied carbon and they're not bothered about this other car over here. As batteries in cars get better, they also have a really long second life. You can use them in applications in buildings, so you can take it from the car and reuse it. So it's true, you've got to look at the full sustainability. I talked about our Steel Zero campaign, and we're working to get automotive companies in there because that's going to be a big use of steel. So that's why it's really difficult to pick off like one sector at a time because it's all so systemic. And we do need to kind of shift everything and think about, the metals that go in, how are they reusable? Aluminium, for example, is 100% recyclable. You can keep using it, So I think, just picking off a bit of it and kind of, sucking our teeth is difficult, but it is hard to be these kind of systems thinkers. And that's why, you end up in a kind of place of gloom. But I am optimistic. I've been to a few of these COPs. There's more people engaged. These announcements, we have to see delivery plans against them. But, a few years ago, we didn't, even 3-4 weeks ago, no one knew if India would show up here, right? And they're here. Okay, you can be disappointed with 2070, but that's the starting point. And as you start to get the kind of, as you talked about rebound effects, we've seen what happens as China invested in solar manufacturing, it brought down carbon emissions elsewhere in the world. So I feel like we're at the start of a journey. You asked what's going to be different in 10 years' time. I actually don't think there's, those of us who grew up in the sort of 70s and 80s and, watched Tomorrow's World every week, we all thought we'd be like hovercrafting around by now. I think the real differences might be invisible. Mm-hmm. So, the electricity that's coming into your home will be more and more renewable, and that's going to be how grids are fired. The car you're driving is likely to start being electric. We work with fleets because actually most of us in UK and similar markets buy second-hand cars. They're second-hand because a fleet bought them, used them for 4 or 5 years, and then put them onto the second-hand market. So probably your next, maybe not the next car, it depends how long you keep a car. Mine's like 15, 16 years old, but it's going to probably be electric, and it'll be a second-hand one that a fleet's had. Homes will, there needs to be a big push on insulation, and that, as we heard about, and heat pumps and things like that. You shouldn't be able to see and feel a lot of these changes, I think. But I am optimistic. I think, it can, and this second week of the COP, it's always a grind. For those who haven't been before, you're going to start feeling quite depressed. Hopefully you come up out the other side of it. But it is because they get very technical very quickly now. But this is actually more active and engaged, and countries are here. These big spenders are showing up. We're hearing big commitments, and I think there's a lot to be optimistic about.
Thank you. Yeah, come to the New York Times Hub and join us at Tortoise. It's not going to be too sad. Emily, what are your closing thoughts, and how might the technologies that you work with every day be harnessed? You mentioned sort of dockyard efficiencies. Is there something perhaps on a larger scale that we can think about to keep our?
Yeah, I also wanted to go back to, I think the embodied carbon emission is a really good example why you need to think about a life cycle assessment. But I also think that they have started to look at that. For example, EV, Scania, trucks, and they're actually seeing that the benefit of electric, even though you have the batteries, etc., it's actually coming down quite a lot. So look into that, and we will see more and more about that. And it's the same when we look at the ICT sector. For example, if you have user devices, then maybe the embodied emissions is almost 50% of the whole emission or carbon footprint of the product. But while we look at, for example, data center networks, it's 10%, right? So then we need to think about, okay, but for a user device, it's good to maybe use it 1 year longer, because then you will reduce the overall carbon footprint. But when you use, for example, a lot of electricity, then the energy impact is so big. So actually refurbish that product and put it somewhere else, for example, in Africa, would be devastating, instead of buying a better new product, and actually that is so much more energy efficient, because that payback would lower the carbon reduction, especially also if you get renewable electricity or so having that holistic perspective and understanding the impact is so important, which I think we need to get across more, not only thinking about sometimes the old sustainability aspect of but we need to reuse them, maybe not always, depending. And getting that impact across. And I think, of course, as we talked about earlier, I think when we saw the 4G came to the market, we didn't really dream about what it could do for example, smartphones. Now we don't really have cameras anymore. Before we have so much more products, material intensive products for doing something that we don't really need today. You can stream from your mobile phone, and we're reducing that material intensity of the society. And I think that can definitely help if you use it correctly. And with, for example, 5G now, we don't really know we have an idea of what we can do. We know for a fact, some good case studies like, 5G to help the port of Verona in Italy, but it still needs to be scaled, right? And we're using 5G within our 5B factory. We talked about assembly, like, how can we change the supply chain to actually not, mounting a product together in Europe or China, sending it to the US, but having a more regionalized supply chain. So we're reducing also the transport emission and being more effective, but also using our own technology within the manufacturing process of the technology itself. Maybe it doesn't make sense, but you can do so many good things, but we don't know all the things we can do. And in 2030, as we talked about, then it will be 6G. And for that, we don't because the technology goes so fast. So we also can't really rely on the involvement of the technology can really help.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I realize that we're eating into the next hour slightly. Martha, if you're still with us, 2030. Martha, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here with a friend.
2030. Let's suppose we have achieved the interim milestone of halving emissions. Are we looking back and thanking technology, or are we thanking something else?
Well, I'm not sure we ever thank technology. I totally agree with Ellen that so much of this is invisible. What I really hope is that everything has happened times X, and I think that we have got many of the tools that we need already. We need to have more people still engaged in the digital world that we're talking about. It's incredibly important not to prevent all the vulnerable people that could benefit from digitization and help manage the way that the climate changes are going to affect them using smart technology, whether that's through better, use of algorithms, as previous speakers have said, or more interoperability of systems, or whatever it might be. So that is a huge chunk of work that needs to happen. But at the same time, we need to deploy the things we know about and invent new things. There is no one simple answer in all of this. I am still fundamentally optimistic that the technology sector, as much as you can define that, and the people that work in it are able to create huge change and systems change, but they're not doing enough. There is not enough focus still, I think, in our sector. There are not enough people who look different to the people that have invented the past who are thinking about inventing the future. And that, to me, is one of the most fundamental things that we need to address, but we need to do it super urgently.
Thank you very much, Martha, Emily, Helen, everybody else. 3 points very quickly that I take away. The question was, how far can we get with the technology we already have? Answer, a very long way. But there's a lot of scaling up to do. And without being too Pollyanna-ish about it, I think probably information technology can handle a lot of that, even if a lot of it will be invisible to us as consumers. But ultimately, as everybody seems to agree, that won't happen without requisite money. And one thing we didn't talk about much, because it wasn't the subject of today's session, was political will. But we'll hear a lot more about that and whether we've got enough of it over the coming week, which I hope won't be too grinding and miserable. Barack Obama's showing up. Maybe he can make us all laugh a little bit. Thank you once again. And thank you to everybody else. Do join us again tomorrow at 8:30. I'm supposed to know, I think I'm hosting it. We have another thinking about leadership and whether it is sufficient for CEOs to simply set net zero targets. Hint, no. Thanks again and stick around, enjoy the hub and join us again tomorrow.